Mr Speaker, this is an important motion before the House. On the 19th of March 2025, the Legislative Council established a select committee entitled The Relationship Between the Dural Caravan Incident and Parliamentary Debates on Legislation. Amongst other things, in its terms of reference, it sought to inquire and report into matters which expressly concern proceedings of the Legislative Assembly that take place in this very chamber. It seeks materials prepared for the development, introduction and debate of significant law and safety legislation that have recently been passed by this House and the Parliament. In particular, the Crimes Amendment Places of Worship Bill 2025, the Crimes Legislation Amendment Racial and Religious Hatred Bill 2025, the Crimes Amendment Inciting Racial Hatred Bill 2025. It sought to examine the contribution of members of this House during deliberations relating to the passage of these bills, who are also members of the executive government. It attempted to prod and pry into information that was provided in this chamber to members of this place prior to and during the debate of the bills. It also intended to inquire into the impact of any decisions on parliamentary deliberations. It is quite clear, in my view, that the resolution passed by the Legislative Council on the 19th of March breaches one of the fundamental bedrocks of parliamentary democracy. It is a fundamental bedrock of parliamentary privilege recognised in New South Wales in accordance with the principles of exclusive cognisance. The prerogative of this House, and we as members of this House, is to control our own proceedings free from outside interference or scrutiny. Leslie Gonyer, the former Deputy Clerk of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly in 2008, provided this description of exclusive cognisance, and I quote, "A collection of supporting principles complements the necessary freedom of speech and debate or proceedings of Parliament as set out in Article 9 of the Bill of Rights. Broadly, what happens within Parliament is a matter for control by Parliament alone. Collectively, this principle of control by Parliament of its own affairs, free from outside interference, is known as exclusive cognisance. This prerogative extends to protecting the Legislative Assembly from interference by other limbs of Parliament, that is, by the other House, the Crown, and the Legislative Council, and the Judiciary, I should add. In 2007, the New South Wales Legislative Assembly Practice and Procedure and Privilege Guide says this, and I quote, "A central issue of parliamentary privilege is the extent to which a House of Parliament should have exclusive control over its affairs. Apart from the power to control its own proceedings implicit in the Bill of Rights, whereby the proceedings in Parliament cannot be impeached and questioned in any other place, Houses of Parliament also have the power to control their own proceedings by regulating the conduct of business of the House, adopting standing rules and orders, and maintaining order in the House and controlling publications of the proceedings in the House. The Constitution Act 1902 under Section 15 confers upon the Legislative Assembly as well as the Legislative Council the power to set its own rules to regulate its orderly conduct. It is by the resolution of this House, and to the extent this House alone, that determines when we meet, the rules upon which we conduct our proceedings and hold to account the actions of our members. Courts in various jurisdictions have upheld the prerogative rights of Houses of Parliament to control their own proceedings. For instance, the House of Lords in 1884, judgment of Bradlaugh and Gossett, held that it had no authority to interfere with the internal affairs of the House of Commons. In 2021, the New Zealand High Court held in New Zealand Post Limited and Preble that it was a matter for a House of Parliament to decide on disputes relating to a course of action exercised by the House under its own rules and standing orders. However, unlike other jurisdictions, New South Wales did not inherit the full scope of privileges employed by the House of Commons or defined via statute the extent to which they apply. It has long been decided that the privileges conferred by the parliaments in Australia and their respective houses is limited to those that are, quote, reasonably necessary, unquote. In the High Court case of Egan and Willis, Justice Kirby said that in order to define the extent to which privilege conferred on the Houses of Parliament in Australia, such as the Legislative Assembly, there is a need to consider, and I quote His Honour, the functions of the House in question and then specifying by reference to the Constitution, state law and common law of the Parliaments those powers essential to the existence of the House as a Chamber of Parliament, or at least reasonably necessary to the performance by that House of its functions, close quote. However, despite this, the prerogative of this House to set up its own rules, conduct and regulate its own affairs, its exclusive cognisance has not been disputed. That is why the resolution of the Legislative Council is so egregious. It expressly seeks to scrutinise the discourse of the House, the conduct of its members, be it a backbencher or a member of the executive government, while undertaking the primary function entrusted upon them by their constituencies, that is, to legislate. This is not the first incursion upon the privileges afforded to members of this House by those in the other place during the course of this parliamentary term. Only in February this year, the Legislative Council passed a resolution under their Standing Order 52 requiring the Premier or the Premier's Department to produce papers relating to motor vehicle use by the Speaker of this House and his driver. This included logbooks, communication relating to repairs, maintenance and cleaning of vehicles. On the 20th of February, I referred the resolution of the Legislative Council pertaining to the Speaker's office to the Ethics and Privileges Committee. I requested that that committee inquire into implications for this House of orders for the production of papers held by the Executive pertaining to the office of Speaker. The committee identified two concerns stemming from the order relating to the Speaker, its implication to the principles of comity and the relationship between the Legislative Assembly and Legislative Council. The principles of comity underpin our bicameral parliamentary system because it calls on each House to respect the autonomy and processes of the other, that of the respective members, and in this instance, its presiding officer, the Speaker. Section 31(1) of the Constitution Act 1902 provides that the Speaker, as the presiding officer of the House, is recognised as independent and impartial representative of this House. The committee raised concerns that the resolution of the Legislative Council relating to the Speaker was inconsistent with the principles of comity. It intruded into the internal operations of the House and exerted authority over one of its members. Further, the committee argued compliance with the Legislative Council order may set a precedence for further orders to produce sensitive documents relating to the Legislative Assembly held by third parties. The committee found that the Council's resolutions relating to the Speaker has significant implications for the preservation of comity between the Houses. And a little as 3 months later, from my early referral, here we are again, referring to the same committee, the Ethics and Privileges Committee, another incursion into our House, the People's House, by those in the other place. He might best be described by a former Prime Minister. Its latest intrusion on the very privileges that have protected members of this place for 170 years. Last night, the Legislative Council agreed to a motion by the chair of the committee concerned, the Honourable Rod Roberts, and moved amendments to narrow the scope of the committee's terms of reference. It omitted references to parliamentary debate to narrow the focus on the passage of the bills concerned through the Legislative Council. However, it is interesting in his speech, when moving his amendments, the Honourable Rod Roberts dismissed the concerns that I am raising here today and the findings of the Speaker of this House, labelling the concerns raised by the Premier as being fundamentally wrong. He goes on to argue that the very principles I asked the House to uphold, quote, do not prevent reference to or examination of statements by ministers in the Assembly in relation to government policy by the Legislative Council, close quote. Respectfully, the Honourable Rod Roberts, I say to you that this House and this House alone will be the arbiter of its actions and that of its members, whether they also be members of the executive or not, particularly when it comes to deliberations that take place in this House. I have taken the opportunity of carefully considering the comments made by the Honourable Rod Roberts and his assertions and his remarks that although moderated later in his contribution to the other place, simply dismisses the very fundamental issues that I have raised. As part of the inquiry, the Parliamentary Privilege and Ethics may also wish to consider concerns about the appropriateness of requiring staff employed under the Members of Parliament Staff Act to support members in the Assembly to attend and give evidence before the committee in the other place, in circumstances where the Minister has declined an invitation to appear. Concerns do arise that this has the potential to, in a backdoor way, undermine parliamentary privilege or attempt to undermine parliamentary privilege by requesting the attendance of members of Parliament at committee hearings under Section 5 of the Parliamentary Evidence Act. It will require careful consideration by the Parliamentary Privilege and Ethics Committee. Nobody wishes to have the power of a House of Parliament curtailed. It is the bedrock of democracy, and it is what underpins our democratic fabric. Courts have always given primacy to Houses of Parliament exercising their common law powers because they recognise they do so in the interests of the people. And whilst members of this House, nearly all of them, snigger at the Legislative Council, they are a fundamental part of the bicameral system, and their function as a House of Review is fundamentally necessary. If experience has shown me anything since I have been a member of this House, is that the function of a House of Review is fundamental, as I have seen so many hundreds of bills progress through this House, where simply because of the other duties of members of Parliament, they don't necessarily in this House always have the opportunity of scrutinising legislation with the utmost care. That is because they have duties of a constituency where members of the other place don't. However, the warning that I do give is that courts will never sit by idly and allow powers to be unconstrained if abused. And the last thing that either this House or the other House or the other place wants to occur is to cause a constraint. There needs to be really an understanding, in my view, that when that power is exercised, that there needs to be a legitimate forensic purpose for the exercise of the power. I clearly understand that we started it in opposition, and that certain things have fallen out of favour and certain principles have become diminished over time. And it may well be as a result of the disagreements we have with the other place that these matters become highlighted. Basic principles such as the executive government is accountable to Parliament. The members of the executive in this House are accountable to this House. It is this House that decides whether or not the Labor Party remain the executive government of New South Wales, not the other place. It is this House that determines whether they have confidence in the Labor Party led by Chris Minns to form a government, and we are not a majority party in this House. It is this executive government that has been reminded repeatedly by the crossbench that determine whether or not we remain the government of New South Wales, that the Premier and Ministers are accountable to this House and not the other place. The other place does not decide who the government of New South Wales is. And so there are certain standing orders that we need to start ensuring are applied. For example, a minister or member of this House is not permitted to even voluntarily appear before the other place or its committee without the consent of this House. And there are a variety of reasons of that, and the reason is because the House is controlling its own proceedings and its own members. And this House's privilege is not the government's privilege and not members' privilege, but it is the privilege of this House. And so these are principles that need to be upheld. We can't do, and I concede we started an opposition, we can't use staff demanding staff's attendance in an effort to get around parliamentary privilege or to get around the principles of accountability. Earlier this year, we had circumstances where junior staff in an electorate office were being summoned or threatened to be summoned to the other place. There has been a convention about staff and ministerial staff. The practice of junior ministerial staff who don't sign up to be frontline political operators being compelled under the draconian powers of arrest to appear before a committee of the other place starts becoming an abuse of power. Now, I assure the House, as I've assured the crossbench, often when governments fail to produce something, it's because governments don't like the scrutiny. But this is a transparent government, the government of the day, and available information is always available. However, privilege, the bedrock of privilege, cognisance and comity between the houses is really a fundamental principle. And what I say to members of the House is that these traditions and these practices to which I refer are practices that even in New South Wales are about 170 years old. For our fleeting time as members of this place, as members come and go, as the democratic process changes, there is one fundamental obligation that we have, and that is to maintain the principles of the Westminster system so that we maintain it and we pass it on to those who come after it. And these principles are hundreds of years old, and they are important principles that we maintain and should transcend politics. I know that if this resolution is carried, that the Privileges Committee has a very difficult task and a complex constitutional task, but they have performed exceptionally well on a bipartisan basis since I've been a member of the House, and for a long period of time a member of the committee, and I urge the House to take the action I propose in the motion.